Okay, so today we have a big announcement for all of you, an unveiling of a very special thing that we've been working for the last year on. And we already mentioned it a little bit in the introductory talk, but we have been really busy following up on the research that we have done on recategorization of philosophy. And like Claire was saying yesterday, we've been putting a lot of work into the theory of it, figuring out what it is that we don't like about old categorization systems, figuring out what we would do better, and then in the spirit of the DRL, actually do it. So we have applied for some funding from the American Philosophical Association to help us do this project. And Quentin has been tirelessly recategorizing everything that the DRL already had. And we have put together a new remodeled website with, well, not the whole website, but like the search system and the category system have been remodeled on the website. And today we will introduce you to what all this was about. So yeah, yesterday I was listening to the talks by Philippe actually with a trembling heart, because I'm just like, wow, are we doing this kind of hegemonic social meta philosophy in here in which we're telling everyone how to categorize philosophy? But I'm hoping that what we're doing is really uncovering, the way the discipline should really be represented as. And you said at some point that not all hegemonic social meta philosophy is bad. So maybe it's this. But yes, we've been engaged in this project. We're very welcoming any kind of feedback from you as well. It's still, we went through some feedback rounds to make it as good as possible, but it's a kind of project in progress. So your feedback would be really useful as well. Okay, so just to run you through what we'll be talking about. What was our motivation for this? This is about a paper that I've written a couple of years ago, the categorical imperfections. What we did in terms of the redesigning of the category system. And then we'll talk a little bit about the implementation, how we've actually done it. And we will officially launch and demonstrate the website for you. I was sitting yesterday, like making it live. So I hope it all works and holds up on us. And then we'll talk a little bit about the next steps, what's in store for DRL in the coming years. Okay, so let's start from the motivation. So a few years ago, like I mentioned before, Annie, who is not here with us yet, invited me to write a paper about something to do with diversity for a special issue of Symposium. And I wrote a paper discussing Phil Paper's category system, in which I was arguing that indexing systems, such as Phil Papers, are a communicative practice, in very much the sense that was discussed yesterday by both Philippe and Josh. Which can carry implicit judgments about the relative importance, generality, and complexity of the subjects that they're representing. They're representing our discipline in a certain way. And I was arguing that the way in which Phil Papers is representing our discipline is marginalizing certain areas of philosophy that are already marginalized in other ways. So first of all, in the way it orders same level categories implies certain relative importance of those categories. It doesn't order them. So most categories in Phil Papers are ordered either alphabetically or chronologically, which is a kind of value insensitive way of ordering things, let's say. But the top level categories are not, saying that metaphysics and epistemology is kind of on top above everything else, despite the fact that it's not actually, alphabetically it comes after, for example, history of Western philosophy. And obviously philosophical traditions get kind of relegated to the bottom of the list in here. And you would go like, well, maybe it doesn't matter. But then when you look at actual value judgments that philosophers pass about the discipline, it really maps onto them. So Leiter Reports was issuing reports on which PhD programs are the most prestigious in the world. And it so happens that most of those programs are the ones that are very metaphysics and epistemology heavy, right? Or David Chalmers and David Bourget also released this paper about what was it? What is it that philosophers think are the most important problems in philosophy? Like 30 most important problems in philosophy, right? And it turned out that 20 of them were in metaphysics and epistemology, like 7 were in value theory, and 3 were in science, logic, and mathematics. And you go like, coincidence? Not sure. So the idea was that, yeah, there's potentially something problematic about this. The size of the categories, I argued, matters as well. And here, shout out to Josh as well, who was arguing that there's something teleological in the way we structure our categories and our way in which we talk about philosophy. Notice here, 17th, 18th century British philosophy, the precursor of modern analytic philosophy, very much divided into lots and lots of subcategories, suggesting it's a very complex issue, right? Notice just for George Berkeley, 2,000 and 2,500 entries. Notice how many subdivisions does Berkeley have, right? Then you go to 17th, 18th century French philosophy, and that's all there is. And you go like, Descartes, double as many entries as Berkeley, no subdivisions, right? Clearly less complex. And then you go, is there a category for 17th, 19th century Chinese philosophy? Just joking, there is no such category at all, right? And you could argue, well, of course, maybe the periodization of Chinese philosophy is not such that 17th, 18th century makes sense, right? But there is no such, there is no periodization that would be equivalent somehow, right? So the idea is that the size of the category kind of communicates how complex it is, and the way it communicated it is not particularly favorable to the already marginalized areas. When it comes to category depth, it's something similar. When you look for Plato, you find him under History of Western Philosophy, Ancient Greek Philosophy, Plato. When you look for Confucius, you find it under philosophical traditions, Chinese philosophy or Asian philosophy, Chinese philosophy, Chinese classical philosophy, Confucius, right? It's kind of deeper in. You need to look for it a bit more before you find it. Then we also have exotifying qualifiers, what I call, and that is basically the idea that some things that have been written in different traditions of philosophy have been qualified with this tradition. For example, here's a paper on morality and human existence from Yang Guang, and this has been categorized as Chinese philosophy ethics. As Chinese philosophy ethics, not just ethics, right? But it's not categorized as just ethics. Yeah? And when you read the abstract of it, there isn't really even that much about Chinese philosophy in that specifically, right? It goes on to talk about Confucius and compares Kant to Confucius, but it's not really about just Chinese philosophy. Right? So the idea is that those qualifiers kind of put this in a other section, yeah? Exotify them. And likewise, we have this sort of miscellaneous and crypto-miscellaneous sections. If you go to Phil papers, you'll notice that when you look for feminist epistemology, for example, it appears under metaphysics epistemology, miscellaneous, feminist epistemology, right? And obviously miscellaneous sections have this implied judgment that there's something unordered about this, something less important and things like this. And I argued also that categories such as philosophical traditions are these crypto-miscellaneous categories in which everything is just like the bag for everything else. Yeah, a bag for all the stuff that's less important. And finally, I argued that by putting things in those categories only, we effectively we include them in the system, but we actually exclude them. Because people who are just looking for things in normative ethics and go to the various categories under normative ethics will not find the stuff that's categorized under Chinese ethics or feminist ethics or something like this. And this is why, for example, Anna's work earlier was so important when they recategorized quite a lot of things that were categorized under feminist X, under also just the X, right? So it's a little bit easier to find. Okay, so this is basically, oh yeah, here we go. All right, so following this, we teamed up together with Quentin and with Claude to write a follow-up paper in which we're trying to propose, okay, so how would we do it better, right? And there's some recommendations that we issued on this, and the idea was that we should have a valueless ordering of all categories, regardless of where they are. We should have equal depth for equal importance of different categories, equal division for equal complexity, decentralized naming, so we don't have those qualifiers. And we should not use miscellaneous categories, or at least use them very carefully. And we have designed a new system in which the idea was that we will get rid of all of the categories which are tradition categories. We will get rid of all of the categories that are time-related categories, and we will only focus with the thematic topics, and everything else will become a filter. The idea is that in the current system that is on Phil papers, when you go in there, it's by design exclusionary. And if you want to find the things that are kind of not central, or maybe in the sense, again, that Philippe and Josh were talking about yesterday, kind of, the Western analytic philosophy especially is presented as the philosophy, and everything else you need to go to the specific tradition to find or specific subcategory to find. We wanted to redesign it so that everything is in the basic place to which you go first. And then if you want to filter out some things, you can do that, right? So in the old system, by design exclusionary, if you want to find the other stuff, you can find it. And with us, inclusionary by design, if you want to filter out the other stuff, you can do that, but you need to make a conscious choice. right? So times and traditions and figures, we have gotten rid of as categories, and we have instead introduced them as filters. And yeah, to action. We got some funding from the APA, we got some funding from the University of St. Andrews, and we made it happen. So now I will pass on to Quentin to tell us what exactly we've done.
So the whole entire project was me talking to all of the editors to basically collate all the information they have about their specialties to thereafter make as representative and usable a system as possible. Tons of challenges throughout, but each one was more or less, how do you say, the best we could do given what we had. So in terms of topics, it's a pretty standard looking list. And so you would say, well, why these many and why these in particular was the big challenge. In terms of usability, I was thinking, okay, so we have only so many editors. And so I was thinking, how many editors do we have? And more or less, this is what it looks like whenever we have all of our editors kind of working on each individual one. Um, Also, I mean, you have things that are included, for instance, like meta philosophy, which is not straightforwardly included in a lot of the other kind of main category topics for Phil papers. Each of these topics, though, kind of breaks down into a section of subcategories as well that was worked out with each of the individual editors as well. So, like I said, in general, my expertise was just listening, and then from there, bringing everything together to actually, see what it would look like and if it would actually be presentable in any way, shape, or form. So subcategories are now available. And then from there, we included traditions such as geographical and methodological. So geographical was probably the most challenging, because I would say more than anything, it's like, well, how do we work out who is a part of what kind of geographical tradition? I mean, the standard response that I would normally give was something like, well, as Socrates said something like, if you have Greek education, you are Greek. And I was thinking of a similar thing whenever we were actually having to go through is that include as many of these as possible for any individual based on where they're from, what education they've received, where they live now, if you'd like. So it's very inclusive in terms of somebody could be Central Asian, East Asian, and European. So in no way does it exclude an option for them. So hopefully that was a way of overcoming that challenge. But even still, I mean, there's something slightly unnerving about having geographical traditions and then saying, well, if they're East Asian, then they're obviously working within an East Asian tradition, philosophically speaking. Separate the two, more or less. Um, there will be some overlap, but the mistake, I think, is to think that the philosophical tradition necessarily follows from the geographical tradition. It's merely a kind of indication of triangulating the person slash triangulating where they might have gotten, you know, overlap in terms of their background in terms of philosophy. Methodological, somewhat also problematic. So, how many traditions are there, methodologically speaking, in philosophy? As it was Philippe was saying, exactly as Philippe was pointing out yesterday, structural Eurocentrism is an issue, but I was also saying structural egotism is also an issue in the sense that, well, you might have a different methodological tradition for just every philosopher. But at some point, we had to break it down into a certain number to where it'd be manageable for people to find what they're looking for. So, for instance, critical is not meant, to be critical theory from the Frankfurt School. It's meant to be critical as in any sense critical. So it can include feminist, Marxist, um, any kind of ism you can think of that's critical of a tradition that's already kind of listed here or previously. Um, Hopefully, it's somewhat exhaustive, but again, it's an artificial kind of pedagogical tool, I think, at the end of the day. Because whenever people are looking for analytic philosophy, they can find it. If they're looking for hermeneutical philosophy, they can find it. And so there was a trade off in terms of the pedagogical needs as well and the usability. Languages is also a feature that we have now. This is just a selection, but basically next to every entry, now we say either what language it was originally written in or what language is discussed prominently within it. Kind of give people another kind of tool to triangulate where, the paper is kind of, or what the paper is engaging with in terms of its own traditions. Historical figures are now also included. A pretty eclectic list here. Obviously, you have your standards: Aristotle, Plato, Val Plumwood, John Rawls. The problem was, in this case, thinking about significance. So, who is significant enough to be included? Um, and the editors more or less agreed that it would be too many biases would more or less be brought in by thinking of significance in this way. So the solution that I came up with, which was a little bit heavy-handed and blunt, was to say if they're deceased, they're significant. Um, and so yes, everybody here is unfortunately deceased, but they are significant in that regard. And it worked out because then again, you would have bell hooks. Sorry, so who's not dead? Oh, that's right. Oh, sorry. Should not be included. Sorry, old list. No, no. Yeah. So significance, like I said, we had to try to bypass the significance issue given whatever biases might be available. Um, so if you're questioning, for instance, these, at the very least, they're a really nice tool for us in the DRL whenever we're thinking about contributions in terms of the internal findings it allows us as well. So it kind of outs us in some regards. And I think that that's a positive thing because then it means we have to think more deeply about what contributions we're making and whether or not we're being as representationally conscious as we should be. So, for instance, geographical traditions, North American is still dominant. Um, so, we still have a lot of work with regard to actually increasing the representation of other geographical traditions. Same thing for methodological traditions. Um, Analytic is still dominant. And in that regard, we have more work to do in terms of boosting different traditions as well. Because if, the DRL is about bringing representation to underrepresented groups and topics, then we have to we can pinpoint better now where we're lacking as the group who's trying to do this. Similarly for figures, in order of dominance, sorry, ignore Patricia, but she is, but Kant is still the most dominant figure within the system. Soren Reeder is second, which I think is kind of cool. And then also G. Anscombe and Jennifer Jackson. Yeah. Main categories we also did a little bit better on, but again, it'll tell us to what extent we're also, how do you say, giving too much priority to one section or giving too little priority to another. So this is, we also have a time feature, and this is going to be the most controversial part of the presentation. So whenever people periodize philosophy, kind of following in from what Josh was talking about yesterday, essentially this is a standard kind of picture that people will provide to students. So the time feature that we have works in terms of ranges, but ideally we'd be able to break it up into periodizations that would allow students to kind of better access different types of materials depending on where they're based, time-wise. Some people have no problem with this kind of periodization. I do, because already lumping everything from pre 700 BC, as Josh was saying yesterday, is just far too blunt and far too unrepresentative of what's actually happening. But the question is, okay, so if we're not going to use these kinds of, how do you say, mirroring of historical periodizations for Europe, more or less, what are we going to use instead? And I think Josh again was aptly pointing out that it's about the entanglement, it's about the transmission of ideas that I think matters. And also, whenever we look at this particular kind of periodization, I don't necessarily think philosophy, except for the fact that philosophy is there. To what extent is this actually representative of global philosophical trends? I would say not that much. It's heftier in terms of what it's saying, but what we're offering here as a potential option, again, this is the next stage of the research in terms of thinking about time, is saying, okay, so what is happening philosophically during these different periods? So, starting with an oralization period, because obviously, if you are doing philosophy in any way, shape, or form, it's often spoken first. That's just a kind of basic presupposition that I was having to take on in order to figure out what might be going on pre 300 BCE and why we'd set it at 300 or 3000 BCE. Sorry, excuse me. What's happening next is that you have a textualization period. So, another important thing to remember is that these are about expansions rather than diminutions at any point. So, at no point is it that oralization goes out of fashion whenever textualization becomes in fashion, or when scholasticization, becomes in fashion, textualization is no longer in fashion. So this is probably going to irk a lot of people. Why shift the scholastic period from the high medieval or mid medieval kind of period to here? That's where the schools are. I mean, it depends on what your notion of scholastic is. Is it just the invention of European universities? Or is it when, you know, 100, flowers bloomed in China? Or is it when hundreds of schools kind of appeared throughout the Mediterranean? Hundreds of schools appeared throughout India. I mean, it doesn't seem to me that there would be any kind of principled reason to not put it here rather than here. Syncretization period, again, this is a time where also transmission increases in terms of ideas actually blending with each other. Commentarization. So there was a point that Paul made yesterday. I thought that was very interesting about calling this period the commentarization period is kind of a mini orientalizing. Ah, I I thought that was an interesting point, but I would disagree with it slightly in thinking that commentarization nowadays is maybe viewed as a kind of lesser activity because it obviously the ref doesn't care about commentaries or these sorts of things, but commentaries at the time were highly prized and also considered the peak of intellectual activity. It's like the best thing you could possibly do was to have something to say about a great thinker. So I don't think necessarily the priorities were the same. And for instance, calling this period the commentarization period is, how do you say, slotting too much under the carpet, more or less. Vernacularization period, people start using languages that are not elite of some sort or restricted to a very privileged few. Professionalization period, I wanted to call this the imperialization period, um, but it's there was some pushback there because I do think the reason why professionalization occurred throughout most places was because of an imperial kind of pressure to start university systems in different countries. So that's kind of still open to debate. And then the popularization period, I was thinking this is also whenever you have certain sorts of mass communication other than text coming out. So, for instance, radio. Now we have people on the radio talking about philosophy, whether it's Benjamin, Dewey, Russell. I mean, even in India, they were also broadcasting philosophy at different points as well. So I was thinking, this is a nice period also for starting to present philosophy to more than just each other as philosophers. Um, and then there's a sense in which also there's a popularization of the discipline itself, insofar as now most people could be included within it. Most, yeah, very, very loosely speaking, most. But at some point, inclusion was allowed. And then you have something of the digitalization period where I'm thinking This is when most philosophical texts now are starting to be put online. And that also includes, like, increases transmission immensely in terms of how people come to think about philosophy is, oh, well, you just go online and you find the paper. Most people read philosophy on their, online as well now. And then as a kind of, how do you say, presaging what the next period might be, you could think, oh, well, there's something accurate about what's happening here. The next step seems to be something like an artificialization period, where potentially artificial intelligence might come to play a part in philosophy. I mean, that still stands to be seen, but that's the prediction, I think, for the kind of periodization we have here. Unfortunately, I cannot tell you every example that goes into each of the period. The paper will hopefully do more of that. But the idea is also that this is not just located in any one one location itself. So it's not just about what's happening in Europe. It's about what's happening across the world with as many kind of resources as we can access to understand what's happening in philosophy at the time. So these are supposed to be generalizations of not just, one location, but a global kind of conception of what's going on. Okay. And I think that's all from me. So this is the next step, but now let's see how it works. Do you have the implementation ready to go?
Yeah, I'll just open. Okay, so now, ta-da, ta-da.
To see how it works.
Now, when you go to the to
You have the mic right there.
The mic.
Thank you very much. All right, so like I mentioned, Quentin was tirelessly at work recategorizing all the almost 2,000 entries that we have on the website. Thank you to all of the editors as well who have contributed to this and have been checking this and really contributing to the development of the system. And now, when you go to the website, you will see some subtle but important changes. So the first thing is, instead of categories, now we have topics in here and a little nice new button. When you scroll down, you have the keywords as they were, but now we also have figures listed in here. You can click on a specific figure and access the database having them. Like Quentin said, Kant is still the biggest in here, but we have quite a few important other figures in here as well. So it's steps in the right direction. Now, as to the specific categorization, it was really important to us, first of all, to develop the system, as in like having the idea that there are topics that are as valuelessly organized as possible. And then there are the filters that are doing this, right? The specific arrangement of the topics, the specific filters that we're using, we think is a little dependent on what project you're running, right? So for the diversity reading list, we felt that this list of topics, this list of filters is a good list of filters. Perhaps if you're running a project that is focused on a specific area of philosophy, or maybe is much broader, or maybe it's much narrower, or whatever else, you might want to do it slightly differently. And then, it would be really great to have your feedback on this as well. But the idea is that there's kind of two projects in here. One is the structure of the project, and one is the specific list of things that are in each filter or in each topic or category. So we thought that these ones work really well for the diversity reading list. And just to give you an example of how this might work, I'll just walk you through an example experience of how you might use the DRL right now and how this category system promotes a kind of different type of thinking about how we do philosophy. So say, for example, that you're running a course on aesthetics, and it's a course on beauty because you need to run a first-year course on beauty and aesthetics. So you would go, okay, well, let's see what's in the aesthetic normativity and value category. And from the beginning, you'll notice that it does the thing that I mentioned at the start, which is that by default, you have an inclusive list of everything from all different traditions, and you can then exclude things, right? So you'll notice in here that we start from Catherine Abel, But then straight away we have a classical Indian text, right? And then we go to some more kind of cultural, not analytic text. And then we go to classical Chinese text. And when you scroll on, you notice that basically it's kind of like quite a varied list in which you have a lot of things from different traditions already included, right? So you kind of immediately see the examples. And you might go like, oh, okay, I didn't know that there is something on beauty written in the classical Indian tradition. Oh, let's check it out, right? And you might want to go and see, hey, okay, that's interesting. I might want to use it in my course. But then you might think, okay, well, I wonder what is there written in, I don't know, sub-Saharan African philosophy about beauty and aesthetic normativity and value. So you would select in here, filters, once again, a beautiful new button. um, and you can unfold this, and then here you see all of the things that we are just talking about, right? So you can, in here, we are already in the topic. We've pre-selected the topic. So this is pre-selected for us. If you're just searching, there will be a list in here as well. I'll show that in a bit. But then you have all of those filters, right? You can filter things by traditions, by languages. And here you can type in a specific time in which you want to look for things. And then we have the old categories that we had already. So what kind of medium is this in? How hard is it to, and so in what sort of class would you be using it, and just how hard to read is it, right? So these are the things that we already had on the DRL before. So say you're interested now and thinking like, okay, so what does the Saharan African tradition have to say about beauty? And you click search and you go like, oh, okay, there's something. And you can now think about, okay, how do I include this in my module as well, right? But say, for example, that you're doing the typical thing and you need to teach, Plato and Aristotle and ancient Greeks about beauty. So you go, oh, okay, well, let's say what else was happening in the world at the time, right? So you say, okay, I know, minus 500 to minus 200, we're using negative numbers for BC. Effectively, it's explained in here. In the future, by the way, we're hoping to have in here a beautiful little slider in which you'll be able to like move things about and have it proved to be the most difficult thing about this entire bloody project to make the slider. I actually paid someone like $500 to put it together and it still doesn't work. Yeah, I hope that at some point in the future we will go past the technical problems. Having done, we'll solve all the philosophical problems, and then the slider is going to be the thing. So at some point you will not need to type in numbers in here. Hopefully we will have this little like thing that you can adjust. Bear with us, we will get it. For now, you can type in the time and you go like, okay, well, what else was happening in the world at the same time as the classical Greek period, for example, if you're teaching things from that period. And you'd go search and see, oh, okay, there's something in the classical Chinese tradition that you might want to include as well to kind of offer a counterpoint to what was going in Greece at the time. But maybe you go like, oh, actually, what I'm teaching about is Aristotle on tragedy, right? So you'd go, okay, well, what else is there on tragedy? And you'd go, okay, let's clear those filters. We're not interested in this anymore, but we're still in the category of aesthetic normativity and value. Let's see what's going on with tragedy. And you go, oh, okay, there's some things. And you go, Schopenhauer. Yeah, I could include Schopenhauer in this. And you can go to figures right now, right? And see, okay, what's happening with Schopenhauer? And then you find out what Schopenhauer in Japanese philosophy, Buddhism, Schopenhauer was influenced by Buddhism. My whole idea of European philosophy as a silo not related to other parts of philosophy is gone. Thank you, Josh, by the way, for this. So you would go, okay, this is really interesting. We have Schopenhauer being influenced by Buddhism. What else is happening? And say, what else was written in Japanese about these sort of topics? You'd click on Japanese as the language in which philosophy was done in here, and you have surprisingly few entries. We need more people who work on Japanese philosophy. Please contribute more entries on Japanese philosophy. But you can also find, some things in here, and you go like, oh, there's. And then you have, all the things that I was talking about are also listed on every single entry in here. So you can see all the topics that a given entry has been categorized with, all the keywords that have been assigned to it, the traditions in which it was written, the languages, and also the figures, right, who were mentioned in the paper or about whom the text is. So at this point, you can click on any of those, and it will take you once again to a place in which you see all of the entries that are categorized with this. So for example, yes, you might be at this point interested in Japanese aesthetics, and you might want to include this in your course as well. So you would click on Japanese aesthetics and once again find out some more texts that might be interesting for you and your course. Or you might think, I don't know, something completely different. Let's see if there's anything in aesthetics. We talked yesterday, like there's so little written in philosophy and motherhood, right? So let's see. And, yeah, I just had the keyword, true. And Japanese aesthetics not. But if you go back to the aesthetics normativity and value, and type in, it turns out that we also do have a text in art and intimacy that has to do with aesthetics and motherhood. And you might want to include this in your module as well. I'm curious now. Get writing, people. Nothing yet. Okay, so this is basically the system. There's multiple points of access to all of those things as well. So like I mentioned, you can go to any of those topic categories. You can explore the way in which we structure this in here, see what's there in moral psychology, for example, see what's there in, I know, the philosophy of life sciences or whatever else. So all of the categories will allow you to hopefully gain access to a fine-grained enough level of topic divisions to find the sort of things you need. Now, naturally, we accept that the diversity reading list is a fairly small resource with not that many things. Obviously, this would work differently if you wanted to apply this sort of system and fill papers, which has millions and millions of entries. You might then want to subcategorize things further because you don't want to have a category that you open and there's 10,000 entries and you don't know what to do, right? But this system could be adapted. It's just a matter of then finding further subdivisions or maybe finding ways that this can be divided better for the needs of that particular resource, right? But the system, we hope, holds. And then, yes, once again, you can access all of those things that I mentioned before, like the keywords or the figures from here. I know you can see what we have on Anscombe, and you can access it in this way as well. Okay, so I think that summarizes the way the system is organized. Now you can also go to our old contribute page, and you will notice that in here, when you contribute a new entry, all of those things are here as well. So you can enter the figures, the languages, the keywords, select from the traditions, right? And select from the topics. You can also, oh, I didn't mention this. There's one thing that I was not mentioning, which is that when you go to the filters, you can also select several of those things at the same time, right? So as it says in here, hold Control to select more. If you're interested really in what was going on in, I don't know, historical and comparative intercultural aesthetics to do with beauty, you can select two things, right? Or you can select even more. You can select existential as well. You can search, and it will come up with texts that were written in the topic. You can further filter multiple things at the same time. So you can see what was written between 1900 and 2010, right? In those traditions. And you will once again see a list and so forth and so forth. You can then go, okay, which ones of those are introductory and easier intermediate to read? And you can search for this. And you go like, oh, okay, that's a list of things I can introduce to my first class on the aesthetics of beauty from the more cultural, non-analytic tradition written around this time that will be easy to read for my first year students, right? I think that's everything for now. Did I pass on? Yeah. Yeah, on the contributors page at this point, we have this form in which there's all of those fields are in here. I was hoping that this will be reasonably self-explanatory, but we will be also adding a little like how-to text, right? That explains the system as well. That will allow people who want to dive into the details or better understand how we're doing it to do that. And referencing the papers in which we have done this at more length. What we have also done for all of you who are volunteers is, damn, I don't remember my password right now. I have it on, my computer remembers my password, I don't. But if you log in right now on the volunteer pages, in the page that is devoted to adding new content, there is a whole run-through through how this should be done and all the information that you would need as a editor or as a volunteer adding new entries to make sure that you categorize it according to the new system. Okay, I think that will be all then. Chloe, am I passing on to you? Awesome. Yes.
Discussion and showing you more things, so I think we'll just move on. If you go back to the slides, yeah. Yeah, great. That's what just happened. That was it. 2.5 years of work. Ta-da! All right. So now I'm going to talk about the next steps because, well, as Simon said yesterday, I tend to be the harbinger of new work and new tasks. He keeps making that joke. I wonder if now it's still like a joke. He's just like, just stop. Yeah. Anyway, so what we want to do, I mean, this is just kind of, okay, we've spent 2 years more writing the paper, thinking about this, trying to like work out some kinks, decide what kind of, kind of flaws we're willing to accept and which we're not. What we want to do now is basically consolidate this, right? We're not done with this, as Quentin was saying earlier. Things that we want to do, well, we want to test it out. We really want to kind of figure out the kinks. We want to figure out what it might exclude, what turns out to be interestingly included. So the more testing you guys do in your searching for various things and the more feedback you can send us, the better. Obviously, we now have our internal findings and we've seen where we're lacking, where we're, strong, where, so this also is going to mean a sort of restructuring of our editorships. So all of our editors who, those of you are in the room, will have, we'll just have to match the new topics to our editorships and figure out who do we want to recruit and how do we want to do it. Do we want to have editors just for topics, or do we want to have, sort of freelance tradition editors somebody who's going to come in and kind of just do a little bit of Japanese philosophy on all of our topics, or how do we want to do this basically? We want to run some kind of surveys on how this works and how this runs. We're not yet at the stage of thinking, okay, how do we apply this to bigger indexing systems like Phil Papers? I think in the past, when we've tried to contact the Davids to say, hey, it was with limited success. And also, as Simon was saying, it's a different beast. So we're hoping that this at least is a proof of concept of how an indexing system that doesn't accidentally or non-accidentally marginalize different things could work, and where else could it be implemented basically, and what other forms. So I think there's still a lot to do on this project, but it's more kind of now, it's out in the world, testing it. What else can we do with it? As Quentin was saying, I think the main thing that we want to focus on is this idea of reperiodization. So there's a paper in progress that we're writing, mostly Quentin. So hopefully you will have questions, you will have feedback, you will have worries and objections about this project. The steps are probably write the paper, reach out to Leah and Josh and try to join forces and see how we can kind of put this into some kind of maybe bigger output. We're looking at various kind of grants to think about transform this into a bigger project. So if you have also ideas of what financial venues might be good places for this. But I think we're turning towards, kind of history of philosophy in we're paying more close attention to history of philosophy recently because we have editors who are very interested in it, and we have lovely history of philosophy talks at this conference. So this is definitely something we want to kind of pay more attention to and think hard about it. But as Quentin was saying, it's a tough one. It's a hard project. How do we periodize globally, I mean, as Simon was saying as well, at the DRL, we kind of are happy with, things being imperfect. Um, we think, yeah, perfection is the enemy of good. Um, so we try to kind of, yeah, figure out in practice, how do we make this the best it can be? So yeah, that's something we're looking forward to. Um, Obviously, we still want to add as many entries as we can, as I was saying. And one excellent way of doing this is by creating more blueprints. So I will be looking at you, trans philosophy blueprint, maybe a socio-meta philosophy blueprint, a metaphysics of motherhood blueprint, uh, and so on and so forth. So blueprints are our kind of little reading group projects where we create these ready-made they're basically mini syllabi or guided reading lists that can be picked up anywhere, and they're really nice little outputs to get funded by first and foremost, which is key. But they also allow us to add a bulk of entries at once, which is really nice. um, so I think that, now that we have this new categorization system, we want to see what it means for our blueprint project and what kind of blueprints we want to put out there. So yeah, if you have an idea for a blueprint, please come talk to me. That would be awesome. And then finally, this is going to be maybe the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years in the trenches. As Quentin was saying, we're maybe in the digital era of philosophy, and we are first and foremost a digital resource. We The website is the DRL, right? It's the hub. Obviously, the people is the DRL, but no, it's the website. Um, and we're very keen to, for instance, not be located, hosted by any specific institution, and so on and so forth, for those reasons. And one thing that is becoming increasingly important, and where I think we're increasingly kind of lacking sometimes, is digital accessibility. Um, the reason why we haven't kind of yet plunged into this is that it's a fairly complex kind of process. What does it mean for digital content to be accessible? Uh, and also, it implies a lot of website redesign and everything, which Simon hates me for. And we've just gone through a massive redesign of the back end and the machinery of the website. So why go for more? So basically, I mean, this is, we're hoping to get some grants for this. If anybody's particularly keen on helping out with this part of the project, we would love to have you on board. But yeah, so this is what I've been looking at. So the web accessibility guidelines, this is a massive international organization that offers guideline on web accessibility for all sorts of websites and organizations. So interestingly, their core principles, what it means for something to be digitally accessible, are actually very much in line or analogous to our principles for what it means for philosophy to be accessible, and for especially philosophy that's underrepresented in whatever form to be accessible, right? I mean, the point is of the DRL is to make it as easy as possible for people to diversify and decolonize, such that there's literally no excuse, because we've done it all for you. If you need to be spoon fed, we'll spoon feed you. Um, so we're very much about, okay, it has to be as straightforward as possible, and a lot of these core principles are similar to ours. So for instance, you'll notice, sorry, it's probably a bit small, but digital accessibility, first and foremost, content needs to be perceivable. I mean, what that means concretely for them is, kind of text-based alternative, video content, captioning, audio, and so on and so forth. How do we use colors, right, on the website? All of this, very nitty-gritty stuff. But the idea of it being perceivable right there and then, I think, is perceivable in multiple sensory modalities, is very key. Operable, I mean, we want the DRL to be as operable as possible, right? As user-friendly as possible. That's something we keep thinking about. And yeah, that's why, for instance, we didn't go for 2 levels of subcategorization. We went just for 1 level because that's just more user-friendly, right? So that was a trade-off, for instance. But yeah, so operable being a key principle of web content accessibility, I thought was very interesting. What does it mean for something to be navigable? How do you like kind of operate and make your way through a website and so on and so forth? Understandable. I mean, this is very loaded. Understandable for whom? How can we get this website to be understandable in multiple languages, in multiple, yeah, other modalities? I think this is key. Robustness, I mean, here what they mean is, compatibility with different OS, different kind of servers, different kind of access to the internet in different places, and so on and so forth, through different devices. Also, I think a key thing. So, I mean, all of this stuff is very practical, right? It means like just thinking about how we present all of this information. Obviously, we want to focus on the content. What is there? All the entries, all the teaching comments, all the blueprints. But the presentation of it is key. And I think that's also what has been, in my humble opinion, the success of the DRL over the last 10 years is that it is accessible, it's usable, it's got a nice color, big on the orange. And, that's actually a very non-negotiable, but yet non-negligible part of what we do. And so, yeah, we need to train ourselves on these guidelines, understand them in much deeper in a much deeper way. And that will take time, that will take effort, and that will most likely take money. So that's the next sort of one of the next big things, because we tend to run multiple things at once, and then we're running our chickens with our head cut off. But yeah, so if anybody has any expertise on that front, or has any insights, or would like to just get on board with the idea of web accessibility, digital accessibility, then please, please help. Right. So I'm going to leave it there so that we have time for questions on the big theoretical stuff, but also the maybe the practical stuff. If you have ideas for future projects, if you I don't know, whatever you guys want to talk about and want to say. Thank you again for everything and for being here to celebrate 10 years. Yeah, we're incredibly emotionally touched. Thank you. I'm gonna leave this out in case we want to go back and says categorization, whatever. But I guess you can self-share questions, thoughts, comments. Have enough? Yes. Thank you. Take a little book. Sorry. Yeah, amazing work. I'll wait for you. Yeah, no, but okay. Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the categorization project. Because so my moment was that as you were harder than periods of time, you were also referring to historical processes. And I was wondering how far-fetched may be to actually just leave the references to like the categorization relies rather than years, rather than making like this relation between historical process and years, just having the historical process there. Why am I thinking that? Just that at different, for instance, regions, you will have that these two processes occur at different times, but it might also be that they occur simultaneously. So you might have like just contextual and historical reasons, places where you might have
it's classicization mixed with some, like, you don't have, for instance, localization. They're like, but a lot of sharing of between blockers and regions. So I was just wondering, how would it look if you were to just have like historical processes rather than actual time periods?
I think it would work better, but I think the problem though is that people just can't get rid of time. I don't think they like the idea of being bracketed like this. So I would agree. I mean, even this is not going to be representative of everyone. It can't be. Um, Again, this was another issue. It's just we have to try to figure out how we fit as many people as possible doing philosophy. I said, and so it seems pretty similar in terms of the day ranges as this one, right? It's just, and that's one thing I don't want to occur either is that basically we just renamed it. We need to be sensitive to what's going on in the actual times. And so that's one thing I was thinking, because also I don't like to have too many periods, because then it's actually not good for the different pedagogy.
Thanks.
And that's what's kind of nice about this is that you can kind of work with a 3-period model and then from there say early, late, and have, modern or medieval kind of in the center of it. But more or less the idea was that for each of these periods, I tried to basically have examples from every single one of the traditions, geographical traditions that we pointed to. So as I'm going in the paper, more or less testing against these dates, whether I can actually, because like I said, started with that, and I was like, okay, so 5 of the traditions do kind of occur within these date ranges. Now the question is, could it be all of the traditions? And that's the next step, basically, is working through to see how fine grained or what kind of changes need to be made to the specific dates for the actually, mirror as many of the traditions as we're talking about as possible. But I agree, it would be because I mean the historical process is a nice way of putting it, because that is how I'm thinking about it, is that it's a movement of history with regard to the medium changing and transmission being different. And the big thing too is also this is supposed to mirror a lot of when different languages actually start, how do you say, putting philosophy into text with their own languages as well. Um, I really don't like the professionalization period because, like I said, if anything, that would be a globalization period. But then again, I think that's the imperialization period. So in general, there's still stuff that needs to be worked out. But the idea that we get rid of the date ranges, it's tough because if we do end up doing the slider feature, that's the idea is that it would match to certain ranges. But yeah, if you have a follow up on that?
Yeah, what is that? Like if you would just, years are years. Leave them like it's fine.
As they are.
You have like historical processes on the one hand, and then years. Yeah, sometimes they match, sometimes they don't.
Mhm.
And I know this goes against the like perfectionist kind of the book, but
I mean,
Yeah.
it's also like, having multiple. I mean, as Simon was saying, the DRL is meant to be, the website is meant to be built as it's like a choose your own adventure kind of thing, right? So if you want to go through this, nice, interesting historical processes journey, you have the option, and then it'll have pop-ups like go or or just the old plain vanilla appears, right? I think Jonas, is it Jonas? Sorry,
Yeah.
Jonas had a finger actually. I was
I
sorry.
did too.
You did too?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So we'll go Frederica, and then I'll run the mic to you.
Yes. I had one of the same reasons, and also with respect to intelligibility, I think these labels are very hard to understand. And I was going to say, definitely strongly prefer something like Age of Empire to professionalization period, because they're the words are just quite hard to understand, I think. And
Yes.
I think it would be easier to have something that names them after something that was going on in the vicinity rather than imposing this model that all philosophical traditions were going through these same movements at the same time, which they weren't. But if you can link them to some years or something else that was going on in those years, like empire. I don't know if it's also me going full Anglo-Saxon, like I'm going full Robert Browning and going, no, age of empire, no, age of steam and steel. We can be the age of chips. But,
Yeah.
I don't know if this is
Yeah.
this is the me doing that thing literature wise, but that would sometimes that's thought to help with intelligibility too. And yeah, so age of bronze, steel, ships,
Gold,
chip.
silver, yeah.
Yes. Because yes, definitely when you said professionalism, kind of, and you went empire, I went, yes, that. Yes.
I mean, that is what's happening in, university context, is that, yeah. It is imperialization. And like I said, I hated that I also had to say isation for everything, but I wanted it to make sure that it emphasized the process rather than it being a moment, Let me show this. It's the age of vernaculization, the age of professionalization, yeah.
Or into the age of empire.
Because that was the thing, is I couldn't do textualization philosophy, period. That sounds, yeah. So
Age of
there was-
politics.
yeah. No, thank you for that. Yeah, that's super helpful.
So yeah, I kind of do feel like the sort of critiques here have a lot of validity to them. I do also think there may be a bit of a counter argument in the sense that considering that we already have this system which breaks up time in a kind of structured way, having it sort of part of a dialectic towards improvement, another competing system which can be sort of mapped on, but which is also disruptive, can be valuable in terms of providing a bridge, including potentially breaking up a little bit the textualization period and that type of thing further. So it might actually have a use as a way of kind of disrupting existing categories through having an alternative set of categories. But my actual question was, there's this tendency to break things up into discrete bounded categories which are mutually exclusive. But is there any real justifiable reason to not have overlap between these time periods, to not have the vernacularization period extend in overlap with the professionalization period, for instance?
It does. So sorry, I maybe didn't emphasize it enough. We have to think of each period as an expansion,
Yeah.
though, rather than a diminution. It's basically, we did philosophy by speaking, and now we do it with writing. Now we do it within schools. Now we do, how do you say, we blend multiple philosophies together. So each thing is progressive in terms and builds. So vernacularization is, sorry, yeah, you had to follow.
But I'm just saying, to accomplish that, though, wouldn't you want to remove the end dates? Like have the end date be like present for all of these?
That would work, yes.
Yeah. Or we need to find a sort of visual way of representing it, whether it can be like a sort of, yeah, there's this way to represent it visually as well on the website that might help. But yeah.
I would say that's a lack of imagination on my part, because I was thinking in terms of the slider. So and basically having to, think
Sorry,
about sliders stopping at some
We're
point.
doing a four-dimensional map.
Yeah,
I was going to say that, like, this is, I think that it's really important as well to remember about what Chloe was talking about in the end about the usability of the thing. At the end of the day, it needs to be usable, and it needs to be usable from both ends. I said it needs to be usable for the people who are using the website, right? So that they can actually, they don't need to go through a four-dimensional map of times to actually find things, but it also needs to be usable for all of you guys for contributing things, right? And our thinking of like, if we can make infinite number of filters that allow us to really pinpoint everything exactly, and we could go so that I know each tradition has its own periodization, for example, right? Or but then how much more can you put into this, and how much do you actually need to know about all of those things to do it right? So it's a trade-off. There's always going to be a trade-off, and there's two parts to this project. And I feel like I've done the easy one of critiquing everybody else, going like, no, you're not doing it right. And these guys have done the difficult part of actually like, okay, how do we do it better? And what you find is that it's really hard to do it better. Yeah, it's really hard to do it in such a way that it's not like excluding anyone. So I think the aim and the underlying thinking in the DRL in general, but in this project specifically, is that, like Quentin was saying, it's not make it perfect, right? It's make it better. And if we can do the system in such a way that it is less exclusive, it will not be perfect, but it will be better than it was. And like we mentioned, it is a conversation. If we can find ways to do that even better, tell us. We will try. Maybe in 5 years' time, we'll have AI that will be categorizing this all automatically for us, and we'll not need to worry about the fact how complicated it is to actually do it, right? So then, I know.
Okay, so I've noted Jonas' hand. Oh, okay. Shintong has a finger, then we'll go to Annie.
Yeah, sorry again. I was a bit late, so I missed part
No
of the
worries.
talk. So I just want to ask you whether this is whether this is the replacement of the other utilizations that are specific to certain traditions, or you're going to also keep the other periodizations.
So that's actually, a big debate that we're having right now is whether we should put them side by side or if we should just completely eliminate the old one and then keep this one.
Okay, so
Um,
I'm really in favor of keeping, insofar as the Chinese philosophy is concerned. I think this is really going to help the students and readers to contextualize and like what the texts are situated in the history of Chinese philosophy. So I really I don't think it's going to maybe there can be subcategories. I mean, you can have it, but with other periodization on the side, or maybe there's a way that if you put it, there's going to be a pop-up. Like I don't know how technically we can solve it, but I think it would be helpful to have other periodization. Actually, it could be also useful if we also have like maybe a periodization of Japanese philosophy, that then we can see how there's exchange of thought or overlapping between the Chinese tradition and Japanese tradition. So I think it would be helpful to keep those.
No, I mean, we were, hard pressing each other about whether we should keep the old one. Also, whether we should have one rather than, as many as for the different traditions that we have. Basically, just work out based on the tradition how to actually and create different periodizations. But then the worry was obviously just overload. The question is whether or not, like for instance, could you use this as a base, but then change the date ranges for different traditions? That was another option. So in general, we're just still trying to figure out how best, to not overload ourselves and users.
These help us win a 2 million grant in the development.
Okay, sorry, Annie, there's a finger from Ian as well. You had a finger, right? Yeah.
Is it worth briefly mentioning that at least some of the tradition? I'm thinking of the kind of the vernacularization period. Thinking if you take the case of the Nahua, so-called Aztec philosophy, we know that there were texts before that, but they were almost all destroyed by Spanish Catholics. And I wonder whether like someone might look at it and think, oh, so there was nothing before. But actually, just a little note saying, well, actually, there were texts. They were just incinerated. And I think something like that might apply to other traditions as well, just in case someone read it and got the misconception. Oh, it's like the Nahua weren't really doing anything before about the 1400s. Actually, they were. We just lost them.
So emptiness is not emptiness, and then when this is like we can't find anything. So for instance, when you do the little search in that little couldn't find anything that met your search criteria, we could add because of the Spanish, or just there could be pop-ups of different things. Okay, sorry, Jody, is that a finger as well or hand?
Yeah, I'm so sorry.
Annie, if you want to turn your hand into a finger,
I think one thought maybe to kind of like accommodate everyone's not aiming for perfection but accommodation is like what might be useful, and this is me again maybe suggesting more work, I'm so sorry. It's like a supplementary wiki that like outlines these like thoughts and discussions so that like you could have this system, have its imperfections, direct people towards a wiki and be like, oh, but there's here's more extensive information if you want to think more critically about this. Here are like the issues that we've come across. Like, it's an imperfect system, you might prefer this system or this system, because then basically you give people information and then more choice and agency, and then they can decide to, to use the slidey scale or use like just the set categories.
Yeah.
And then you could, like, a wiki would also be useful for
Yeah.
other things to supplement
Yeah.
information on the website.
Yeah, really important. Well, put it this way, I have an ulterior motive also with this periodization, which is that as far as I think this one is the one most people use, I think it's debunked. We have too many counterexamples for, why none of this actually fits anything other than a very Eurocentric kind of conception of philosophy. This one, I'm hoping, will also, how do you say, be falsifiable or not. So maybe this will actually, we will find examples that won't fit this. And then from there, we can get even more fine-grained and realize.
Yeah.
But the idea is that this is more general, whereas this is more specific. And so I think that it will be helpful if we do include something like a wiki where we could see the examples and these sorts of things. And then as counterexamples come into play, then we will have to rethink again what it will look like afterwards. And I think that's, in general, that's how I think periodization should work in terms of making it into something that's responsive to the actual historical examples rather than just leaving it as a stagnant, no, that's just the way it is, mentality with regard to this. Yeah. So that's the idea. Is I think we need to be updating our thinking about these sorts of things as we go. And I think the wiki would be really cool.
And in general,
At least
yeah.
for me. Yeah.
I mean, in general, we're always like thinking, oh, I mean, obviously transparency is a big part of, we're trying to kind of say, hey, this is why we've created this thing. So, and here's the background research and here's that. And but we don't want to overload each individual pages, but we want to leave little Easter eggs like, oh, do you want to learn more about why we thought about this way? Click here. And then with kind of leaving space for things being, again, web accessible and so on. Yeah. Can I go to Annie and then, or Annie, what's your question about?
If you've got a finger,
I've got a finger, but fingers keep cutting you off.
it's a really interesting.
Yeah, I wanted to say it really simply. I think thinking about it sort of as an Americanist, I mean, the Americas, or what gets called the Americas, they don't exist for Europe, Asia, or Africa until 1500 or 1492, if you want to use the magic date. So the periodization project can only be retrospective, but it's got to be retrospective in a way that's not Eurocentric. And that's kind of almost impossible given our conceptual categories, because we had, this is all Mignolo's idea of Latin America. You've got a European world, you've got an Asian world, you've got an African world. You can do things on those timelines. But America, even though it exists, it doesn't exist yet for these other places. And so part of the difficulty I think that we're having is we're thinking from a kind of one world, whereas once upon a time there was three worlds, and then there was another world, and it got kind of all messed up. And so I liked your idea, Ximena, of figuring out, well, what's going on, but it may just be doomed, because telling a retrospective story about the world, when in a certain sense the world doesn't exist for human consciousness until a later time, it's at least a tricky project. I don't know if it's doomed, but I still think it's cool that we're talking about it.
I think one option, so for instance, my idea of recorded history is actually it's not just what's on. So for instance, I think oral histories also count. A lot of people might disagree with that because then obviously it's harder to cite, and also to verify and all those other sorts of things. But I do think that, for instance, whenever it comes to indigenous philosophies like North America, Central America, South America, oral history will have to play a part in terms of how we think of recorded history. And I don't think that most people would appreciate that in most kind of historical disciplines, maybe. But I think it's just the only way that we could potentially triangulate what's being thought, before, the other half of the world sees that there's another half. Yeah. So I mean, that would be that's the kind of the solution that I was thinking of. So that would be an option, but again, it's still super limited. But gotta work with what we have. Yeah.
Annie.
Yeah, thank you so much for that presentation and also for the discussion. It's been really, really interesting to hear all of your thoughts. And I should say, like, I think it's amazing how far the project has come since Simon's inception of it. I think it's really easy to kind of get a bit carried away with the philosophical criticism of everything. And that's vital and it's urgent and it's really, really necessary. But also, it's necessary to take stock of how far you've come and the impact that the project has had. So, yeah, thank you so much for that. My question, though, is about the traditions and the classification of traditions, because Quentin said something very interesting about the figures. You mentioned that defining an important figure had, there were surrounding questions about significance. I was wondering about the categorization of traditions. Sorry, you've had to flick through like 4 slides there. The categorization of traditions raises similar questions, right, about significance, because I kind of see a few traditions that arguably are absent there. But I just wanted to know a bit more about your thought processes when it came to defining traditions or choosing which traditions to focus on.
So I would say in this case, the challenge was not to have too many, because again, overload, but at the same time to include as many as possible with what we could include. So critical, I agree, is probably masking way too much. So for instance, any kind of a critical tradition is going to just be a part of critical. And
Yeah.
sorry.
No, I'm looking at the paper because in the paper we list what we're thinking behind under each tradition. But go ahead, yeah.
Comparative and intercultural as well could also mask a lot of the kind of cultural traditions and also cultural. But if, for instance, for cultural, the issue is we can't include all cultures. It's just over too many. There are too many cultures. And also it changes a lot as well. I would say culture is constantly changing. So it would be hard to update it. So we had to find something that could remain consistent over time, but also not be too massive in terms of presentation on the actual website. And I'm curious, which ones do you think are missing? Because everybody give as many, throw as many out as you can. Yeah.
Criticizing you, I don't want to do that.
No, it's good. It's good. I don't mind.
No, but yeah, because it might be. I mean, so Quentin was trying to think of, these words are meant to be understood as broadly as, and sometimes the understanding that we have of the word is not actually what we mean, or is broader than what we mean. So it might be that some things are actually we would subsume within. But yeah, sorry, please.
Yeah, I was thinking continental, but then I know a lot of people dispute the existence of that category. But then some continental philosophers self-identify as continental philosophers. So yeah, just categories like that.
Yeah. The way I was imagining it was, in that case, I was thinking maybe continental, but then I thought from there I'd have to put existential, phenomenological, hermeneutical into continental.
Yeah.
Although continental also,
We're trying to have non-place name, non-geographic kind of conception into the tradition. So yeah, a lot of continental stuff is going to be under a lot of the geographical tradition, but also might come up in hermeneutical, critical, and so on. And yeah.
it was a difficult one because obviously people see there's this massive division as well. And they would think, oh, well, if analytics up there, then continental should be up there. So
Ian has a finger.
Yeah, thinking on Alan's point, looking at the list out of you have those traditions methodological now. Now, some of those things do need methodology, so phenomenology, for example, experimental philosophy, whereas others are self-consciously philosophical movements or doctrines, the pragmatism of both that. as well. Whereas something like religious was either given two pages. That only includes methods. It doesn't necessarily include a generalized set of doctrines. Whereas something like historical, they're all historical methods. So it's kind of all the methodological would seem to include some of them, whereas others are something more like doctrine, only distinguished by their ambitions or their aspirations.
Yeah, in that case, I would have to say the way I was thinking about methodological was also pretty broad as well. So, and religious, again, also was very difficult because they're very, there's so many different religions, and basically I couldn't put them all down. And so it's like, it's an approach to philosophy with religion in mind, is how I'd understand religious methodologies. Or if that's
Well, include Nietzsche, for example.
with Nietzsche, where would I put Nietzsche?
Well, I think it was like philosophy with religions in mind. I think Nietzsche very often had religion on his mind. In a sense, not to call you religious.
I see.
I mean, some text might come up as, you know, under some of Nietzsche's text might come up there and some might not, you know.
Critical and religious, yeah.
Yeah. So, and the way we're categorizing is the idea, at the end of the day, the idea is that the person looking for it will find it, right? So I think that it is important, of course, to have, you know, the right structure in there and to make sure that we are representing, but it is also important that at the end of the day, you know, the user actually gets the things that they're looking for. And to ensure that, our general approach was to be kind of generous with assigning those categories, right? So that if you're not sure where it is, it's probably in both, right? So if you're looking for it and you're not sure if it will be in historical or cultural or comparative, we probably categorize them in all of them, so that when you're looking for it, you find it. And this is one of the kind of like practical ways to get around the fact that it's always this. I mean, it's a model. It's always going to be imperfect. It's not going to represent. And it's like the boundaries will be fuzzy, right? And many of those things, like if we wanted to do it exactly perfectly right, then there will be one paper in every single category, and we'd have 7 million categories, right? So this is like over categorizing a little bit was our way to make sure that somehow we get around this problem and just keep the site on a be practical.
Yeah.
I want, yeah, so I'll take a finger from Josh, then Philippe, then Suki, if that's all right.
Yeah, I think the practical side of it and like what people are searching for is helpful. It might again be helpful to have a discussion somewhere on the site that says these are the kinds of categories that in Euro-American universities tend to be the things that people are building courses around. And so this is how people might find alternatives for those kinds of courses. Because I mean, I think when you presented it, you mentioned a kind of Eurocentric bias in this. And I think this is very much the categories that have, you know, been around through European philosophy in particular, and sort of make sense of that and subdivide that. I'm not sure that these make a lot of sense for other methodological approaches in other parts of the world and other contexts. And I would be a bit confused myself as to like where to find the Nigerian conversational school of philosophy in this. Probably cultural would be my guess as to how it ends up being captured. And that's, I think, it recreates a Eurocentric problem, or risks recreating a Eurocentric problem, in that, for example, a lot of African philosophy will end up in cultural. Maybe critical, maybe comparative or intercultural. And like certainly certain texts might end up in hermeneutical or existential and so on. But by and large, there's a risk of kind of reinscribing that, like, well, African philosophy is basically just cultural identity stuff, or something to do with like folklore and wisdom and worldviews, and there's nothing else. So yeah, I mean, I think there's it is really tricky for all those reasons to accent, and we've been talking about. But I think it is, yeah, I don't know exactly what the solution to that is, but thinking of how to maybe reframe what methodology means, maybe approaches as a kind of more catch-all word, or being a bit more careful about what the categories are and trying to enable to think through the categories, not only from like what would a European university lecturer want to teach in their course and where would they go and find things, but also if you are teaching in South Africa, for instance, and you wanted to go and draw on different kind of methodological approaches, how would you make sense of that? And that's a big ask for people who are mostly in European universities, I guess.
No, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I find that cultural and religious are the two shames of the methodological bit, if anything, because it's lumping way too much together. And that would include not just, African traditions, it would be any tradition that basically didn't have, or that did have something like a geographical location associated with it. So even indigenous philosophy, from North America would be in cultural. And I think that that's problematic as well. But I also was worried about, how do you say, so for instance, should there be an indigenous methodological tradition? And that was another kind of issue about whether we should include that, because it seemed almost like we were saying that there's indigenous methodologies that are different from how everybody else is doing these sorts of things, when actually there was a lot of issues associated with how to understand, different ways in which cultures have engaged in philosophy without kind of, in a sense, fetishizing it, I guess is one way of putting it, with regard to how they're doing philosophy. Like, they're doing something really different here, when actually they might just be doing the same thing, but just, with, a background that's very different from the way that most people would think of, a standard philosophical background. We're still gonna have to grapple with this.
I can just jump in very quickly.
Yeah.
One of the ways in which we're trying to account for that also is to notice that this is the methodological traditions. We also have the geographical traditions. And the idea is that sometimes there is not a specific methodological tradition, right? It's more accurate to classify with respect to geography than it is with respect to methodology. Sometimes it's more accurate to run by with respect to methodology and not geography. Right? And so we're trying to account for these sort of things in that way as well. But again, I mean, it's an imperfect system. Hopefully, it's a little bit better thanks to the ability to do one or the other as well. And some things will just not be classified under any methodological tradition. They might just, however, have a geographical tradition.
Philippe?
Thank you. Great, thank you. My hand has become a finger somehow, I think. So that part of what I'm going to say, I think, builds on what Josh just said. So first, I want to congratulate you. This is amazing job. This is really an amazing job. And I understand that it's very difficult to categorize anything. It's a bit like democracy. It's like any form of categorization is the worst possible categorization, except for perhaps all the other ones, if you're lucky, right? So I understand that it's extremely difficult. You have to make extremely difficult choices, and you make great ones here. So keep that in mind regarding what I will say next, which will be a bit more critical, because this is what we do. Now, I agree that a lot of these categories are that you have in terms of what are the main the categories themselves, the periodization methodologies. They are all, to some extent, Eurocentric, frankly speaking, if I am going to be brutally honest.
Yep.
The thing, though, is that I don't think, and this is building on what Josh said, in fact, I don't think it's as problematic for each, I shouldn't use category because one of the categories is category, but for each section of the websites in the salon, or each, and the reason why this is the case, I guess, is because of the, who the users are going to be. I don't think the goal of the website is necessarily for people like me to find out Chinese material to teach in my classes, of course. And also, it's really for people who teach a class on, let's say, ethics, and who want to diversify that. and therefore they look for something from the Chinese or African tradition in ethics, right? And if that's the goal, then it makes sense that your categories are very Eurocentric. If your main aim is for the website to help people in Europe, in places where philosophy is taught with those Eurocentric categories, to diversify their curriculum, so there can be a pragmatic use in that sense. And I think having a sort of discussion of why you make these methodological choices can be useful on the website. Something you might already have, I'm not quite sure, but certainly that can be useful. Yeah. But there are other, I think, categories where Eurocentrism is a bit less justified in terms of I'm thinking, the periodization I find still unfortunately quite Eurocentric. I mean, commentarization applies to the entire scope of Chinese philosophy, if you will. I mean, some people present Confucius himself as a commentator of the Zhou dynasty. I wouldn't agree with that. I think that's Han Dynasty people sort of projecting their own work onto Confucius in order to justify what they're doing, which is commentating. But essentially, from the Han Dynasty onwards, from the beginning of our era, a lot of Chinese philosophy is commentarial. So perhaps having just, dates might be an idea, or having just a timeline where you select a century so you can see what's going on across the globe in philosophy within a particular century, despite the fact that the timeline itself is Eurocentric in the sense that Chinese history worked very differently in terms of dates, meaning that they used to categorize history in terms of the emperor's dates, which is problematic in itself as well, but for different reasons. So so I guess that could be one, because I don't see a reason quite as much for periodization as I see for categories in terms of retaining a more Eurocentric approach in terms of who will use the website, I guess. Methodologies, perhaps a bit more in a sense. I can see perhaps some people teach the analytic tradition, I guess, or phenomenological tradition. And in this sense, it can be useful to have these categories. I would certainly add the commentarial tradition in there. It's an important one, I think, throughout, not just in China, but in India as well, in Europe as well. And it's one that challenges the sort of author God, which is central in the sort of modern European tradition of doing philosophy. So I think for that reason alone, it's quite important. So I guess, these were my comments. I guess just, thinking about which types of Eurocentrism are more problematic for the purpose that you have, I guess.
Sorry, do you want to say something? Yes, and yes.
Great. Sadly, comma, sadly.
Yeah. No, but adding a tradition filter for
Commentary,
commentarial
that would be good.
is definitely not something too hard to do,
No.
I think, right? In traditions.
This is always going to be problematic, though. It's too hard to think of. So I think of this as artificial in the first place. It's more or less just a way of thinking about or categorizing phenomena that are relevantly similar. And at the end of the day, I don't really see any of these things as separate. So I personally don't. But the problem is I think for pedagogical reasons, and I think it would depend on where you are as well. This would shift, and I don't think that any of them would be final in some sense. And I think, but it's hard. But it's hard to get people in the mindset also of seeing these as artificial distinctions as well, because some people genuinely believe in them as like hardcore distinctions between the phenomena they're talking about. Whereas I don't see phenomena as that distinct. I see them as very intertwined. Like if I'm doing philosophy of mind, I could easily be doing any of the other things as well in a paper. So it is going to have to be catered towards, the kind of, and I mean, one way of thinking about it is also whenever we're teaching, I mean, this is something that was really interesting about Paul's talk for me, is that as we're teaching, maybe we should, how do you say, always hedge and saying, this is just a way of kind of categorizing for the sake of what we're doing in terms of focusing more on this aspect of the phenomena rather than this aspect. But ultimately kind of hedge by saying, but that's we're artificially distinguishing here. But
Well, I want Suki.
Sorry,
And then, but Josh, we'll talk about it at the break, sorry, because we're like, but yeah. We're 5 minutes over, but I definitely want Suki's question.
yeah.
Wow. You sure?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for
Thank you.
yeah, everything. And yeah.